On a clear September morning in 2001, Donna Summer stood at a window in her Manhattan apartment and watched the sky turn poisonous. Sirens screamed. Paper fluttered past like ash-colored snow. Smoke rose where the towers had been, thick enough to feel in the throat. For a woman whose entire life had depended on breath, on the ability to swell her lungs and pour out sound, the idea that the air itself might now be dangerous lodged like a stone in her chest. She shut the windows. She shut them again when friends said it was safe. Even years later, living far from New York, she kept the glass between her and the outside world, convinced that something invisible had already slipped inside. Those lungs had once powered the sexual revolution on a dance floor, pushed "Love to Love You Baby" and "I Feel Love" across oceans, built an empire of glitter and synths and sweat for strangers. Now doctors were telling her there was cancer growing where those notes used to rise. Maybe it was bad luck. Maybe it was genetics. In her mind, it was that day, the dust, the smoke, the terror woven into the air. What does it mean when the same lungs that taught millions how to feel good become the site where the body finally turns on the woman inside the myth? To understand how a life gets twisted into a shape like that, you have to rewind, past the dust cloud and the diagnosis, back to a girl whose first stage was not a nightclub, but a church. Before she was Donna Summer, she was LaDonna Adrienne Gaines of Boston, Massachusetts, one child in a black family whose week revolved around the African Methodist Episcopal Church. The building itself was nothing glamorous. Wooden pews, worn hymnals, a pulpit smoothed by decades of restless hands. But when the choir rose, the walls expanded, voices stacked and lifted the ceiling. Sunday after Sunday, and the shy girl in the robe at the end of the row felt something inside her answer. Her first solos were not planned. A director heard her cutting through the harmonies, that particular mix of warmth and steel, and pushed her forward. One Sunday, she stepped out from the line, heart pounding under the choir robe, and opened her mouth. The note came out larger than she was. People turned their heads the way they would later in nightclubs and arenas. Back then, it was because they thought God had put something in that child. In that world, a powerful voice was not a ticket to fame. It was a responsibility. Talent belonged to the Lord before it belonged to any label. LaDonna soaked up Mahalia Jackson records, the way sorrow could be poured into a song and come out sounding like hope. The way a single held note could make weary people straighten their backs for one more week. But Boston's streets outside the sanctuary doors were still narrow. The future that lay visibly in front of her looked small. School, perhaps some office job, some compromise between her restlessness and her parents' expectations. The radio, though, told of another universe, soul, rock, funk, names and sounds from cities she'd never seen, voices that sounded like hers, or like distorted mirrors of hers, were making it out. When the musical hair came through her horizon with its scandalous talk of nudity and Vietnam and free love, it was everything her church warned against and everything her ambition leaned toward. A German-language production needed American singers. An audition in New York became a lifeline to somewhere else. She went. She sang. They said yes. At 18, she packed what she had and stepped onto a plane. Boston shrank beneath her. The Atlantic opened up. On the other side waited Munich, a city of stone squares and unfamiliar vowels, where she could walk down the street and, for the first time in her life, not instantly register as somebody's daughter from church, somebody's neighbor, somebody's nice girl. She was foreign everywhere, and in that foreignness there was a strange kind of freedom. The German cast of hair taught her cues and lines and swear words. She learned to shape English vowels to fit German ears and ride the show's chaotic choreography. Nights on stage bled into days in small studios, singing demos and jingles to pay the rent. Somewhere in there she met an Austrian actor, Helmut Sommer. married him, and had a daughter. The relationship did not last. The surname misprinted once as Summer on a record label did. LaDonna Gaines, church soloist, became Donna Summer, almost by accident, a typo that hardened into branding ink. The new name had an easy, glossy sound, like the season it invoked. It would end up printed on millions of records, stitched into denim, flashed on marquees. For now, it was just a helpful alias for a Black American singer trying to get booked in European studio sessions. Munich's studios were full of men who believed the future of music lay in circuits and repetition. Two of them, Giorgio Moroder and Pete Bellotte, had been hunting for a voice that could humanize their experiments without drowning them in old-fashioned melisma. They found Donna. She brought them scraps of melodies, lines scribbled between gigs. One of those scraps was a simple idea: love to love you. On paper, it was modest, little more than a hook. Moroder heard something else. What if they stretched the idea until it stopped being a song and became a mood? What if, instead of another 3-minute tune, they built a 17-minute trance? To do that, they needed a performance that wasn't just sung but embodied. Donna, the church girl with the big voice, found herself in a studio with the lights dimmed low. To get past her own embarrassment, she imagined she was Marilyn Monroe, breathy, teasing, giving the microphone what the microphone wanted. She lay down on the studio floor, the track looped in her headphones. She began to sigh, to murmur, to shape those sighs into melody, to ride the rhythm until the difference between acting and something more personal blurred uncomfortably. On the other side of the glass, the men watched the meters spike and knew they had caught lightning in a bottle, or at least something they could sell as lightning. Love to love you, baby, landed like a scandal wrapped in plastic. Radios either refused to touch it or played it so often that it seemed to seep into the walls. In some countries, the uncut version was banned. In others, clubs demanded it, craving the way it could suspend time for 17 minutes, bodies pulsing in a dark room, while a woman's recorded pleasure wrapped around them again and again. For millions of listeners, Donna Summer became the sound of permission. In an era when many were still negotiating with their own shame, especially queer men whose very desires were criminalized or pathologized, the record raised a middle finger to restraint. It suggested that a woman's pleasure could be public, amplified, placed at the center of a dance floor, and that everyone else's could orbit around it. Inside the woman whose voice provided that fantasy, the experience was more complicated. She felt proud of the craft, the stamina it took, the control, but also hunted by the image she had helped birth. The daughter of the Amy Church had become, in headlines and promotional copy, the First Lady of Love, a body and voice for sale. Casablanca Records understood immediately that they had found not just a hit but a persona. Photo shoots leaned into the heat, satin sheets, parted lips, heavy-lidded eyes, light catching on bare shoulders. Poster after poster pushed the same message: this woman exists to be desired. Interviewers asked about the moans, about what her parents thought, about whether she was that way off stage, the nuance that she had been acting, amplifying, playing a role in a dark studio did not fit the narrative. Narratives are easier when they are flat. So Donna Summer, the character, took off. The woman underneath tried to keep up. Moroder and Bellotte, restless by nature, did not stop at one shock. They were already thinking about stripping disco down to its skeleton and rebuilding it with circuits. For that, they needed her again, but in a different register. Less breath, more steel, less bedroom, more spaceship. I Feel Love arrived like a broadcast from a future decade. Gone were the plush strings that had cushioned 70s dance tracks. In their place, a metronomic drum pattern, a synth bass line that pulsed with inhuman precision, airy electronic arpeggios that seemed to spin endlessly upward. Donna's voice floated over this grid, echoing and delayed, more disembodied than ever, and yet still undeniably human. She sounded like someone feeling something intensely personal inside a machine. Musicians heard the record and saw their own futures shrink. "I have just heard the sound of the future," Brian Eno famously said. DJs saw club crowds lock into the groove, as if the song had rewired their nervous systems. The track distinguished itself from everything around it. You could argue that entire subgenres of electronic dance music 70 years later still live in its shadow. With each new success, Donna's schedule became less a calendar and more a conveyor belt. There was Saturday Night Fever culture to ride, charts to dominate, photos to shoot. Last Dance snagged an Oscar via a film about nightlife. Hot Stuff and Bad Girls pushed rock guitars into disco's domain and ruled radio. 3 different singles hit #1 on the Hot 100 Inches, 1,979 alone. There were tours where nights blurred, motel rooms where she woke up unsure which city the dressing room flowers had come from, award shows where smiles became muscle memory. On stage, she delivered what was expected: big notes, controlled improvisations, flirtatious asides, gowns that caught the light. She was both idol and mirror ball, reflecting back to audiences their own fantasies of freedom and glamour. Off stage, the machine demanded more than a human being can give indefinitely. Insomnia, once an occasional annoyance, dug in as a permanent resident. To get up after too little sleep, there were stimulants. To switch off after too many hours of adrenaline, there were sedatives. Doctors wrote prescriptions to keep the wheels greased. The same industry that printed posters calling her extraordinary treated her body as a replaceable engine. If it sputtered, medicate it. If it objected, ignore it. She began to feel, in her own words, like a money-making machine. No one wanted to shut down. People's livelihoods were attached to whether she said yes to one more date, one more album. The guilt of disappointing them braided with the exhaustion. Every attempt to slow down ran into a wall of expectation. When she looked in the mirror, she saw not just herself, but the jobs and mortgages of the people orbiting her. There is a point, in that kind of life, when the idea of stopping permanently stops being unthinkable. At some point in the late 70s, in one of those anonymous towers that look like every other luxury building from the street, she walked onto a balcony and looked down. The drop was long enough that there would be no survival, no rehab, no comeback narrative. Beneath her, traffic honked and flowed, oblivious. Behind her, the apartment held costumes, makeup, contracts, trophies, all the proof that the performance version of herself was thriving. For a moment, the idea of stepping off was not melodrama but mathematics. Remove the problem, end the contradiction. 17 minutes of fake ecstasy had given her the world. 17 seconds over a railing could take her out of it. She did not go over. The reasons are known only to her, and whatever she believed was listening. A remembered hymn, the thought of her daughters, some stubborn shard of survival instinct. She backed away, but she knew, as she crossed back into the apartment, that a line had been crossed internally. If she could come that close, something fundamental was wrong. It is one thing to be marketed as the embodiment of pleasure. It is another to realize that this embodiment has brought you to the edge of self-annihilation. In the aftermath, the vocabulary of her childhood came roaring back. She returned, visibly and audibly, to Christian faith, not the vague cultural Christian identity of many Americans, but the fervor of the born-again. For a lot of secular critics and fans, it seemed like a sharp left turn. For her, it was a return, or an attempt to climb back to a starting point that now lay far below layers of sequins and gossip columns. That change in spiritual direction collided head-on with the contractual reality of her career. Casablanca, and Neil Bogart in particular, had capitalized ruthlessly on her sexualized image. Royalty statements and treatment at the label had left her and her team feeling exploited. The fight that followed was part financial, part symbolic. She sued for millions in unpaid royalties and damages. The label defended its accounting and its narrative. The litigation turned her, again, into an object discussed in conference rooms. Who owed what to whom? Who really owned the voice on those records? She eventually severed ties with Casablanca and signed with Geffen, determined to pivot artistically as well as spiritually. The first fruits of that shift, The Wanderer, blended rock, new wave, and gospel-inflected themes. Her voice was still unmistakable, but the way she used it was different. Less about seduction, more about testimony. She sang about drifting souls and searching hearts, about not belonging fully anywhere. A pretty accurate description of a Black American church girl who had become a European disco queen and now saw herself as a Christian artist in an industry that thought prayer was bad for sales. The charts received this reinvention politely rather than ecstatically. The era of pure disco was over. Rock radio was never going to embrace a former sex goddess without conditions, but the record mattered deeply to her. It was proof that she could reshape herself, at least partially. Without waiting for someone else's permission, the 80s did not simply become a decade of hymns and retreat. Donna was still, at her core, a songwriter tuned to the lives of ordinary people. One of the most enduring images from that time begins, again, in a bathroom. After the Grammy Awards one year, she attended an after-party at Chasen's, a famous Hollywood restaurant where the carpets absorbed more secrets per square foot than most confessionals. At some point in the evening, she slipped into the ladies' room. In a cramped attendance area, separate from the chatter and champagne, a woman in a uniform sat slumped in a chair, asleep. The television flickered shadows across her face. The fan turned slowly overhead. Empty paper towel rolls stood in a corner like spent shells. Donna looked at the lines of exhaustion pressed into the woman's posture and thought, not as a star, but as a Black woman who knew something about labor. She works hard for the money. The phrase snapped into place like a puzzle piece. She scribbled it down on whatever was available. Some tellings say a napkin, some say a scrap of toilet tissue, and carried it out of the bathroom like a found object. She works hard for the money became something different than the songs that had made her famous. The beat was urgent, fit for clubs, but the story it told was about women like Onetta Johnson, unseen and underpaid, standing in bathrooms and behind counters so that other people's nights could feel effortless. The video showed waitresses, factory workers, caregivers, a chorus of lives the mirror ball never quite reached. In an era when MTV still treated Black women as exotic seasoning rather than main dishes, having that song in heavy rotation mattered. For once, the image of Donna Summer broadcast to millions was less about what her body could sell and more about who her eyes could see. But while her art reached outward toward solidarity, another fracture line was opening in the ground under her career. One that would affect her relationship with a community that had been central to her rise. From the beginning, disco had been incubated in queer spaces. The first rooms where Love to Love You Baby and I Feel Love truly lived were not suburban living rooms but gay bars and clubs. Places where men who faced police raids and public hatred could, for a few hours, claim their bodies without apology. Donna's voice had become a kind of liturgy in those rooms. Under spinning lights, she presided over scenes that the rest of the world preferred not to see. In the early 80s, as AIDS started tearing through those same communities, every signal from the world outside, politicians, preachers, families seemed to say the same thing. This is your fault. This is a judgment. Rumors began circulating that Donna, now vocal about her evangelical Christianity, had joined that chorus. Various versions of the story proliferated. Some said she had told a crowd that God made Adam and Eve. not Adam and Steve. Others added lines about AIDS being punishment for sin. There was no clear recording, no definitive transcript, just fragments from concert-goers, quotes in gossip columns, anecdotes retold in anger and pain. In an era before smartphones, words could travel far faster than evidence. For fans who had danced themselves into a sense of being lovable under her voice, the idea that she saw their deaths as deserved felt like betrayal. At the most intimate level, boycotts were organized, activists picketed shows, discos once built around her records stopped playing them. Some literally smashed vinyl copies of her albums in public, as if breaking the plastic could rewind the part of their lives her songs had soundtracked. Donna maintained that she had been misquoted and misunderstood. She said that private conversations had been distorted, that jokes she had repeated unthinkingly were turned into dogma she did not share. She insisted she did not believe God rejoiced in anyone's sickness, that she did not hate gay people, that her faith and the love she felt for fans were not in contradiction. Eventually, she wrote a letter addressed to the gay community, apologizing for any hurt she had caused, affirming that she believed in the dignity of everyone who had ever danced to her music, insisting that the cruelest phrases attributed to her were not her heart. Whether that was enough depended on where you stood. For some, the gap between accusation and apology remained too wide. For others, the complexity of a black woman raised in conservative Christianity, thrown into global fame as a sex symbol in queer spaces, then trying to make sense of scripture and suffering in the middle of the AIDS crisis, was at least understandable, even if painful. What is clear, from a distance, is that her life sat at an uncomfortable crossroads. The church she clung to for survival had often been used as a weapon against the very people who had given her music its first home. The club that had made her feel adored had not always been a safe place for the language of faith. Walking that line publicly meant she would almost certainly step wrong in someone's eyes. By the time the 90s arrived, the wider pop culture had filed disco under retro and moved on. House and techno producers in Chicago, Detroit, Berlin, and beyond were building entire scenes on rhythmic and sonic foundations she had helped lay. But her name did not appear in their club flyers. Grunge and hip-hop were being marketed as the authentic voices of a new generation. For industry executives, Donna Summer was now legacy inventory. Valuable in the catalog, less urgent on the release schedule. She continued to tour, to record, to stand on stages and feel crowds surge under her again. But she also made choices she had not been able to make in the rush of the 70s. She pulled back from the constant grind. She moved with her husband and daughters to quieter homes, first in California, then on the East Coast, eventually to Nashville. She painted canvases filled with color and shapes no one had ordered, no one expected. There were no chart positions for a line of blue or a spray of gold. In her memoir, she wrote with surprising calm about things that would have broken other people. The balcony, the pills, the lawsuits, the misunderstandings, and the certainties that had shifted under her feet. She wrote about God not as a marketing angle, but as if she were still that church girl being told that her voice was a gift she would be held accountable for. Then came that September morning, when the sky over New York turned into a weapon. From her apartment, she saw the towers burning and then gone. The air, once the invisible medium that carried sound, became visible as a thick, gray-brown mass swallowing streets she recognized. Sirens stitched the day together. People ran covered in dust that did not wash off easily. For weeks afterward, the city smelled like things that were never meant to burn. For someone whose life had already taught her that invisible things, fame, expectation, shame could injure as surely as visible blows, the idea that the very air could be contaminated took root. Rational reassurances about particulate matter and wind patterns did not reach whatever part of her brain had watched papers and bodies fall. She kept the windows closed. She developed a private ritual of control, glass-sealed, curtains drawn against certain angles of light, breath measured. Years later, in Florida, far from the island of Manhattan, doctors found cancer in her lungs. Families and journalists tried to map cause and effect. She had never been a heavy smoker, they said. She believed the dust from 9/11 had lodged itself in her lungs and metastasized into this. Medical experts talked about multiple risk factors, latency periods, the impossibility of drawing a straight causal line. For her, the line felt straight enough. The fear she had lived with since that morning now had a name and a shape on a scan. Chemotherapy and faith share a rhythm. Infusion, waiting, nausea, prayer, repeat. The woman whose breath had once filled stadiums spent long stretches in rooms where breathing was a chore and silence was loud. She did not broadcast these parts widely. There were no reality shows, no public pleas. Beyond what the tabloids stitched together, she had always tried, when not working, to disappear as much as possible from public view. In illness, that instinct hardened. In May 2000, at 63, she died at home in Naples, Florida. No stage lights, no encore, just a family losing a wife and mother. The news hit the networks in push notifications and breaking news banners. DJs dug out old vinyl. Newspapers ran obituaries, balancing the words Queen of Disco with phrases like born-again Christian, controversy, pioneer. For some, the loss was an occasion to remember nights when her music had made them feel alive for the first time. For others, then, for their music, it reopened old wounds. In the years that followed, the story did what stories always do. After a famous person dies, it got rearranged. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame inducted her, placing her in the pantheon as a foundational figure in dance music. Critics revisited I Feel Love, now with the benefit of decades of electronic music history behind them, and elevated it from important single to one of the tracks that rewired pop. Producers in their 20s and 30s spoke about the track as if it had always existed, like a law of physics, something they had discovered rather than something someone had once had to invent. Her daughter Brooklyn co-directed a documentary, Love to Love You. Donna Summer, built largely from private tapes and home movies. Viewers saw a mother clowning around with her kids, a wife arguing and reconciling with her husband, a believer wrestling with doubt, an artist rolling her eyes at some of the more absurd demands of fame. The archival audio laid bare how thin the line between gratitude and regret had often been for her. Meanwhile, club culture moved into new eras. EDM festivals with pyrotechnics and giant LED screens. Underground queer parties, reclaiming disco with a political edge. TikTok trends using fragments of songs that predated the app by 40 years. Somewhere, at almost any given moment on a weekend night, someone is still dancing to Donna Summer, even if they do not know her name. The lungs that once delivered the soundtrack to their joy are gone. The recordings remain, infinite and tireless. So what do we do with a story like hers? It is easy to smooth it over into a one-line triumph. Church girl becomes disco queen, changes music, is remembered as an icon. It is equally easy, in a more cynical age, to flatten it into a cautionary tale. Industry exploits black woman, woman breaks, dies, end of story. Neither version accounts for the balcony or the bathroom, the letter to the gay community or the windows taped shut after 9/11. Neither explains how someone can help invent the future of dance music while feeling increasingly trapped inside a persona that exists to please others. When an industry invites a devout young woman to pant into microphones, packages her moans as liberation, and then shrugs when she nearly steps off a hotel balcony, who exactly has been set free? The artist, whose body becomes a marketplace. The listeners, whose genuine rush is mediated by images designed in boardrooms. Or the middlemen, who get to frame the whole affair as empowerment while banking the profits. When a community of queer men already under siege turns her songs into a private liturgy of joy, only to hear that she may have spoken words that align with those who wish them dead, where do gratitude and betrayal meet? How do you mourn the role her voice played in your happiest nights, and still honor the memory of friends who died under the weight of theology? She seemed, at one point, to echo when a woman who spent her youth inhaling stale club air, cigarette smoke, and stage fog becomes convinced that one specific plume of dust over Manhattan killed her. Does it matter whether science can prove the connection? Or is the truth simply that the world she helped animate with music also filled her lungs with particles of its violence until her body could not process them anymore? Most of us meet Donna Summer now as an echo, a hook dropped into a DJ set, a vocal chop in a remix, a line of melody in a supermarket playlist, a chorus on a retro night at a bar. The echo does not tell us about the nerves under her skin, the prayers whispered into pillows, the legal documents, the handwritten apology, the paintings in a Nashville studio. Those details do not cancel out the records. The records do not cancel out the harm or the contradictions. They coexist, like lights and shadows on the same spinning mirror ball. Maybe the most honest way to remember her is not to decide once and for all whether she was an icon of liberation or a cautionary tale of exploitation, a hero of queer dance floors, or a betrayer, a saint who found her way back to God, or a sinner who never stopped running from herself. Maybe the harder, truer task is to hold all those images at once. The church girl, the woman on the studio floor breathing orgasms into the dark, the figure on the balcony, the star scribbling a bathroom attendant's exhaustion onto a napkin, the believer writing a letter she hopes will heal a wound, the middle-aged mother closing her windows against invisible dust, and then, standing under whatever cheap or expensive lights we happen to be dancing beneath, to ask ourselves one more question. When the beat that was born from her lungs makes our bodies move and, for a few minutes, makes us feel more alive than usual, are we just escaping into the fantasy she helped create? Or are we also, in some small way, honoring the very real, complicated, fragile human being who paid for that fantasy with every breath she ever took?